I'm kind of repeating myself because there are some in the church who say that we are kind of in a new day, and because of a new president who kind of wants to make America great again, the Kingdom Now Dominionists and others who are related to them are going to make the world perfect. And that just isn't possible, folks. That would take 20 trillion years, and they still wouldn't get there. Ron Rhodes, Jesus says in John 18:36, "My kingdom is not of this world. My kingdom is from another place." So why does any earthly entity feel they have to establish the kingdom?
Well, it kind of reminds me of the Tower of Babel, when they tried to build this tower up to the heavens. It's again the fact that people tend to have this tendency towards godhood and wanting to take control. And listening to the clip just a moment ago, this idea of the manifest sons of God and becoming overcomers and attaining divinity and all of this, just think how offensive that is in the ears of the one true God. A friend of mine, Norman Geisler, said, God cannot bud. He cannot blossom. God has always been in full bloom. That is, God is and always has been God. And human beings do not become God. You know what? If I'm a God, what do I got to read their literature, the literature of Kingdom Now people, to find out how to do it? If I was God, I'd already know I was God. When you look at the attributes, Jan, between God and man, it just becomes so very clear. God is all-knowing, but man is limited in knowledge. God is all-powerful, but man is weak. God is everywhere present, but man is confined to a single space. God is holy, but man's righteous deeds are filthy garments before God. God is eternal, but man was created. I could just go on and on here. But this idea of human beings, through this manifest sons of God doctrine, becoming exalted and divine, I think that we are ripe for judgment if this kind of idea continues to perpetuate in America.
Ron, as serious as this is, though, is this a salvation issue? And if so, at what point?
The gospel of the kingdom, in a way, has been redefined, don't you think? I mean, the gospel according to Jesus Christ is that I am a sinner, Jesus is the Savior, He died on the cross for me, He resurrected from the dead, thereby proving the truth of all that He said, and by placing my faith in Him, I am saved. Now, how often do you hear that in Kingdom Now theology? Rather, what you see in Kingdom Now theology is all about works, not just based on the Old Testament, but based on this idea of discipleship. This is a big emphasis in the movement, and the idea is this. In order to establish world dominion, restoration teaching must be universal, and you can't do that without the universal obedience of all of its followers. And that's why there's a rigorous discipleship program that's been introduced in Kingdom Now churches that ensures that every Christian is under authority and is unable to err from the proper teaching of Kingdom Now. And I got to tell you, a lot of these people have a lot of fear and guilt. This is a movement that bludgeons church members into obedience, and these shepherds are actually getting involved in who people can marry, where they can work, where they can buy and sell and stuff like that. It's become a very oppressive thing. And if I've got to do all of that to rightly relate to the kingdom of God, boy, that sounds like the kingdom of the cults to me.
Yeah,
Good
it
point.
Really does.
Good point.
I agree completely with what you just said, and I hope people really did take heart in and listen to what you had to say, because I think a lot of people, because of their misunderstanding with this, they would try to say, well, it's just a little quirky side idea. It doesn't mean that much, but it really does.
Let's talk for a minute or two here about one of the drivers of this movement. It's called the New Apostolic Reformation. And, gentlemen, I don't think this was around, at least not under this name, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Would I be right there? This is more of a modern phenomenon, maybe the last 25 years?
It is more recent, and they're titled the way they're titled on purpose. On the one hand, it is considered an apostolic movement because, like some of the others here, some of the other movements we've talked about, they claim that they're restoring the lost office of apostle to the church. And these apostles have the same miraculous powers as the New Testament apostles did. And it's also reformation in the sense that this movement will allegedly change the way church is done.
Okay.
It's going to have a massive transformation on society. And, with the biblical government of the church in place with prophets and apostles, they're supposed to be involved in raising up God's end-time army. And this is their own word. They say that this army will be invincible. Its troops will work miracles and prophesy and help the apostles cast out high-ranking super demons that rule over American cities and cities all over the world. And as we've talked about with some of the Manifest Sons of God doctrine, some of the leaders in the movement claim that their followers will overcome sickness and death and execute God's judgments on earth by prophetically calling down the plagues described in the book of Revelation. So my personal view is that this apostolic Reformation movement has basically picked and chosen from some of these previous movements and merged it into this super popular movement. And let me just emphasize that it is super popular. I am reminded again of the fact that the Scriptures teach us that in the end times, people will fall away from the truth, and they will bring in teachers who tell them what their itching ears want to hear. And so I think that that's being fulfilled before our very eyes, because this doctrine sounds very appealing to the human ear, but it is flat unbiblical.
Well, I'm just going to name a few who are in the stream here. I'm going to make some people extremely angry because they will insist that they follow this person, and there's simply nothing wrong with what they teach. But those who are a part of what we've been talking about here for half an hour or so, we've already played a clip of C. Peter Wagner, referenced Earl Polk, who is now deceased, as is Wagner, Bill Johnson, Bethel Church, Rick Joyner, though I've heard Rick say that he's a part of it, and then I've heard Rick say he's denouncing it, so I'm not sure exactly where Rick stands. We've got Lou Engle, we've got Mike Bickle of International House of Prayer, and quite frankly, I could name another 20, but I'm not going to go there. We've got Mr. Rushdoony, who's a part of the Reconstructionism movement, Gary North. Those perhaps are gentlemen a little less known because they're not quite so noisy about what they believe. Can you enlighten me on this Rushdoony and Reconstructionism?
These guys became popular back in the 60s and 70s, and Rushdoony in particular focuses very heavily on what he calls theonomy. And that's just a fancy theological word that refers to the rule of the law of God. And so Rushdoony believed that all of society should be ordered according to the laws that govern the Israelites in the Old Testament. And so in his thinking, everyone is still bound to the Old Testament laws. The only exceptions would be is whether or not the New Testament set aside a particular law. And Reconstructionists, who are probably the brains of this whole thing, we've talked about a number of different movements. The Reconstructionists are the most intellectual. And basically, they teach that the world will be Christianized through the church's preaching of the gospel, and thereby usher in the millennium, which is then followed by Christ's second coming, after the church has Christianized the entire world. Now, Reconstructionists reason that believers should take dominion of all areas of society, including politics and the arts, and just about everything you can think of.
Yes.
So this is a movement that grew out of Reformed theology. It's become pretty big in America. And even though you may not have heard of these guys, the influence of these guys has been pretty immense.
I think, and Eric, you teach quite often about this, because the mainline Protestants sort of came along with their social justice, social gospel to tie into what we're talking about. And now, of course, evangelicals are heading that same direction. Lots of evangelicals, leftist evangelicals, are embracing leftist politics, totally the Democrat Party, because they feel that's the only party that's going to make the world right again. So this is not just right-wing politics, though dominionism is often tied to the right wing. Not necessarily true. Would I be right there, Eric?
You're going to find a lot of this inside the emergent circles because they completely disavow any literal end-time events, and it's all about making the earth better and social justice and so on. And a lot of people are following along with this, and again, do not realize where the end is, don't realize the error that it is. I first saw this years ago when I was a youth pastor in a church that was strongly, we're talking about radically millennial. That was before I didn't know what that term meant. This is like a couple of years after I was saved. I was already in a youth pastoring position, and there's where I found out I could never believe those things. But Rushdoony and others, I think, have inspired many of the emergents.
What's interesting is that they target you and I pretty strongly. These guys will teach, for example, that these people who believe in a rapture of the church, they're just escapists who don't want to be involved in changing the world or transforming the world. Now, that's really an ad hominem argument. It's a personal attack. I believe in the rapture not because I want to escape helping the world. I believe in the rapture because the Bible teaches it. Right. Read 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 13 through 18. Now, I must also say that even though they don't hold to end-time ideas, they do use end-time words. They'll talk about the millennium and they'll talk about the tribulation, but they'll say stuff like, we're already in the millennium. Or they might even say we're in the tribulation and that the church is bringing the tribulation to bring about transformation. So again, I have to say that reminds me of the cults, because the cults will often use New Testament words, but they'll pour their own meanings into those words. Now, that's not universally true of every person that's involved in dominionism, but it's true of enough of them. And so it ought to be a concern to Christians across the country.
Just because we want to see good things happen in the world and want to have the right people put in political positions, it doesn't mean that we think we're somehow going to captivate the world by doing so. I think we should do the right thing that would put people in a position where they could receive salvation and the gospel can be preached freely and our free speech isn't in a bad position, nothing like that. So when you talk about politics or any of this stuff, in fact, spiritual warfare, I just released a new book on spiritual warfare, and people immediately think, oh, you think that you can take over the world. They've taken the idea of deliverance for the captive that Jesus preached over and over. They have now extrapolated that to become control of the planet. It's an amazing leap that goes on here.
I think also, this is just me personally speaking, with one of my biggest beefs about this whole thing, and that is how we need to emphasize that the apostles in the New Testament were utterly unique. We've witnessed in our own culture a massive shift in how people know the truth. It used to be people would go to the Bible, which was written by the prophets and the apostles. But today, number one, you've got a whole big reinterpretation of the Bible. And number two, you've allegedly got new prophets and apostles teaching new things. And when you measure that against the Scriptures, it doesn't wash.